Rommel, Patton, Eisenhower, Montgomery. Every great commander of the 20th century studied Napoleon in detail, but there was one man whose campaigns the British Army taught even more carefully than the emperor's, because he was the only general who had ever stood across a battlefield from Napoleon and walked off the winner. For most of his career, the French had refused to take him seriously. Napoleon himself dismissed him with a single sneer, a sepoy general, a colonial officer who had won his reputation against barefoot Indian princes and would surely crumble the first time he met real European troops on equal ground. That sepoy general was Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. The man Napoleon called a bad general would, across 12 years and 3 continents, fight roughly 44 engagements in the open field and never lose a single one of them. He would humiliate 3 of Napoleon's most decorated marshals. He would break the largest army the French Empire ever sent into Spain, and on a wet ridge in Belgium, on a Sunday morning in June, he would do the one thing no other commander on earth had managed to do. He would beat Napoleon in person. But what exactly set him apart from every other general of his age? Let us take a closer look at Wellington's 3 greatest tactical moves of the Napoleonic age. By the autumn of 1803, the British East India Company was at war with the Maratha Confederacy, the last great power left standing in the Indian subcontinent. Their armies were not the disorganized levies of imperial cliché. They had been drilled for years by European mercenaries, equipped with modern muskets, and fielded an artillery train so professional that French officers in the service of the Marathas openly considered it a match for anything in Europe. In command of a small company column, moving up from the south, was a 34-year-old Irish major general named Arthur Wellesley. He had with him about 4,500 regular infantry, a few thousand allied Indian cavalry, and 17 guns, marching against him in a vast crescent across the plain near the village of Assaye, where roughly 40,000 Maratha troops, under the German mercenary colonel Anthony Pullman, supported by close to 100 heavy guns. The Maratha princes were so contemptuous of the small British force that they had ridden away from the camp that morning to hunt, leaving Pullman to deal with the problem. Wellesley rode forward to a low rise and studied the ground through his telescope. The Maratha army was drawn up behind the Kaitna River, a deep watercourse with steep banks, and his local guides assured him there was no ford for miles in either direction. To attack head-on across the river would be suicide. To retreat would invite the Maratha cavalry to swarm the column on open ground. But as he swept the horizon, he noticed something. On opposite banks of the river, almost facing each other, sat 2 small villages, Pipulgaon on his side, Warur on the far side. He reasoned, quietly and to himself, that no 2 peoples build their homes directly across a river from one another unless they have a way of crossing between them. There had to be a ford. The guides were either lying or wrong. He marched his entire column to the spot, found the ford, and crossed it under heavy fire from the Maratha guns. As he splashed through the water at the head of his men, a cannonball decapitated the orderly riding at his side. By the time the British line reformed on the far bank, the Marathas had wheeled their entire front to meet him, and the battle had become exactly the head-on slogging match Wellesley had spent the morning trying to avoid. What followed was 3 hours of the bloodiest fighting Wellesley would ever see in his life. The 78th Highlanders, anchoring the left, walked forward into the Maratha grapeshot and broke the first line with disciplined volleys at 50 paces. The 74th, on the right, followed the pickets too far toward Assaye village and was nearly annihilated. Every officer present was killed or wounded. In one company of 50 men, 48 fell. The Maratha gunners fought with a courage that haunted British memoirs for the rest of the century. They were bayoneted at the muzzles of their pieces, refusing to leave them. And then, as the British infantry passed over the captured guns, men who had thrown themselves down feigning death, sprang back up, turned the cannon, and fired into the redcoats from behind. Wellesley personally led the cavalry charge that retook the gun line. His first horse was shot dead under him. His second, his beloved mare Diomed, was speared through the chest by a Maratha pikeman as he rode through the smoke. When the firing finally stopped, roughly 6,000 Marathas lay dead or wounded across the field, and Wellesley had captured 98 of their 100 guns. But his own losses were appalling. 428 killed, 1,138 wounded. Over a third of his engaged force gone in a single afternoon. Years later, when an old friend asked him to name the best thing he had ever done in the way of fighting, Wellington answered with a single word, Assaye, and did not add another. He also wrote, more soberly, that it had been the bloodiest battle for the numbers that he had ever seen, and that he should not like to see again such a loss as he had sustained on the 23rd of September, even if attended by such a gain. The pattern that would define Wellington's entire career was already visible at Assaye. Read the ground more carefully than the enemy reads it. Hide the true weight of your force until the moment of contact. Strike the instant the enemy overextends himself. These three habits, the careful eye, the concealed strength, and the timed counterstroke, would become the hallmarks of his art of war. Before we move on to Wellington's second masterpiece, if you are enjoying this kind of detailed tactical breakdown, do consider subscribing. There is a lot more like this on the way. Because 9 years after Assaye, the sepoy general would be standing on a different hilltop, in a different country, watching a French marshal commit exactly the same kind of mistake the Marathas had made, on a scale 10 times larger. By the summer of 1812, Napoleon's empire was at its territorial peak, and the war in Spain had become a meat grinder that no French marshal could quite finish. Wellington had spent 4 years on the peninsula, building a reputation as a careful, defensive general, a man who would choose strong positions, fight from them, and refuse to be drawn out. Marshal Auguste Marmont, Duke of Ragusa, and one of Napoleon's youngest and most ambitious marshals, was certain he had taken the measure of him. Wellington, in Marmont's reading, would never attack. He could be marched around, herded, frightened into retreat. He was a defensive specialist, and nothing more. For 3 days in the second week of July, the two armies marched parallel across the dry hills around Salamanca, sometimes within musket shot of each other, each searching for an opening. Wellington had roughly 48,500 men and 54 guns. Marmont had about 50,000 and 78 guns. The forces were as evenly matched as anything in the war. On the morning of the 22nd of July, 1812, Marmont saw what he believed was his moment. Dust clouds were rising from the British rear. Wellington's baggage train was withdrawing toward Ciudad Rodrigo. To Marmont, this could only mean one thing: the English were retreating again. If he could get his left wing across the front of Wellington's army and onto the Portugal road, he could cut the line of retreat and destroy him. He began to extend his divisions westward in a long marching column along an L-shaped ridge. The lead division under General Thomier surged ahead. Behind it, Mokoun's division followed, then Clausel's, each separated from the next by a widening gap, because Marmont believed there was no army in front of him capable of punishing the gap. What he did not know was that Wellington had kept the bulk of his force concealed behind the reverse slopes of those very ridges, completely out of sight. Marmont was looking at the dust of the baggage train and assuming it was the whole army. By tradition, Wellington was eating a cold lunch on a hilltop when his telescope swept the French column. The story goes that he stared, lowered the glass, and exclaimed, "By God, that will do." He threw down the chicken leg, mounted his horse, and galloped to his far right, where his brother-in-law, Sir Edward Pakenham, was bringing up the 3rd Division. The exact words he gave Pakenham have been reported differently by every officer who claimed to be present, but the substance is well attested. "Edward," he said, Move on with the 3rd Division, take those heights in your front, and drive everything before you." What followed has been called by French historians the most cleverly fought battle the English ever won. At about 3:30 in the afternoon, Pakenham's 3rd Division crashed into Thomier's leading division from the flank it could not turn to face. Thomier was killed in the first volleys. Nearly half his men fell within minutes, as Mokoon's division formed squares to receive what it thought was a cavalry threat. Leith's 5th Division walked up the hill in line and shot the squares to pieces in a stand-up musketry duel. And then, as the French left dissolved, Major General John Gaspard Le Marchand led the heavy cavalry brigade in one of the most devastating charges in the entire Napoleonic age. 5 British dragoon regiments rode through 8 French battalions in a single sustained charge, sabring them down where they stood. Le Marchand himself, the man who had personally designed the British cavalry sabre, was shot in the spine as he tried to break a final square. He died at the moment of his masterpiece. Marmont, watching from the center, was struck by shrapnel in the opening minutes of the disaster. His arm and ribs were shattered. His deputy, General Bonnet, went down beside him moments later. The French army had lost both its commander and its second-in-command in the space of a few minutes, exactly when it most needed direction. Wellington, watching the wreckage of the French left collapse, simply rode along his line, feeding fresh divisions into the gap. By nightfall, 14,000 Frenchmen had been killed, wounded, or captured. 2 French Eagles and roughly 20 guns were in British hands. Wellington had lost about 5,000 men of his own. The decisive phase had taken, by legend, just 40 minutes, and men would say afterward that he had beaten 40,000 men in 40 minutes. General Maximilien Foy, the French divisional commander who covered the retreat, wrote 6 days later in his diary that this battle was the most cleverly fought, the largest in scale, and the most important in results, of any that the English had won in recent times. He added that it brought up Lord Wellington's reputation almost to the level of that of Marlborough. Up to this day, Foy wrote, we knew his prudence, his eye for choosing good positions, and the skill with which he used them. But at Salamanca, he has shown himself a great and able master of maneuvering. And again, just as the Marathas had at Assaye, the French had badly underestimated the man they were facing. Again, he had read the ground better than they had. Again, he had hidden the true weight of his army behind a ridge until the moment of decision. And again, he had struck the instant the enemy overextended itself. But as the war wound down toward its impossible final act, Wellington would be sent to confront a catastrophe on a scale never seen before in European military history. He would be sent to fight, in person, the man who had built the largest empire in the modern world. By the spring of 1815, Napoleon had escaped from his exile on Elba, marched into Paris without firing a shot, and reassembled the Grande Armée for one last campaign. His plan was elegant and brutal. He would smash into Belgium, separate the British and Prussian armies before they could unite, and destroy each one in turn. On the 16th of June, he beat the Prussians under Blücher at Ligny, while Marshal Ney fought Wellington to a bloody draw at the crossroads of Quatre Bras. Wellington then withdrew his army north along the muddy Brussels road to a low ridge near a village called Mont Saint Jean, on Blücher's promise to march to his aid. On the morning of the 18th of June, 1815, Napoleon sat down to breakfast at the farmhouse of Le Caillou with his marshals. Soult, who had been beaten by Wellington in the peninsula, urged caution. Napoleon dismissed him with what would become one of the most famous misjudgments in military history. Because you have been beaten by Wellington, the emperor said, you consider him a good general. I tell you, Wellington is a bad general, and the English are bad troops. This affair, he added, will be the matter of a lunchtime. A few miles north, on the ridge of Mont Saint Jean, Wellington was speaking to the Prussian liaison officer, Baron von Muffling. Now, he said, Bonaparte will see how a general of sepoys can defend a position. Wellington had roughly 68,000 men and 156 guns. Only about a third of them were British. The rest were Dutch, Belgian, Hanoverian, Brunswicker, Nassauer, and King's German Legion. Napoleon had about 72,000 men and 246 guns, having detached a third of his army under Marshal Grouchy to chase the defeated Prussians. And once again, exactly as he had done at Assaye and at Salamanca, Wellington placed the bulk of his army on the reverse slope of the ridge, hidden from view, sheltered from artillery, leaving only his skirmishers and guns visible on the crest. Napoleon, looking up the slope through the rain, could not see what he was actually attacking. The battle began late in the morning with a French assault on the fortified chateau of Hougoumont, a walled farm complex on Wellington's right flank. What was meant as a feint to draw off British reserves became a meat grinder that consumed 33 French battalions and nearly 14,000 men by nightfall. At the height of the fighting, a giant French sous-lieutenant named Legros axed open the north gate and led a party of grenadiers into the courtyard, before a handful of Coldstream guardsmen physically forced the gates shut behind him and bayoneted every Frenchman trapped inside. Wellington said for the rest of his life that the success of the entire battle had turned upon the closing of the gates at Hougoumont. In the center, French infantry corps assaulted the ridge in massive columns and were repulsed by disciplined musketry. Then, from about 4 o'clock, Marshal Ney made a catastrophic error. Believing the British line had broken when he saw casualties being carried to the rear, he launched the French heavy cavalry up the slope in massed charges without infantry or effective artillery support. Wellington's infantry formed squares. For more than an hour, French horsemen broke around the squares like surf against rocks, unable to break a single one, while British and King's German Legion gunners ran back to their pieces between charges and fired into the cavalry at point-blank range. As the artillery duel raged around him, Wellington turned to his staff and said, "Hard pounding this, gentlemen. Let us see who will pound longest." By 6 in the evening, the center was in crisis. La Haye-Sainte, the farmhouse anchoring Wellington's middle, fell to the French when its garrison ran out of ammunition. French batteries pushed up to within musket range and began tearing the center apart. The line bent. Whole battalions had been reduced to fragments. Sir Thomas Picton, who had been so rushed from Quatre Bras that he was still fighting in his civilian clothes, was killed leading his division. Lord Uxbridge, commanding the cavalry, would later have his leg shattered by one of the last cannonballs of the day. "By God, sir," he said to Wellington as the shot took him, "I have lost my leg." "By God, sir," Wellington replied without changing expression, "so you have." And then, around 7 in the evening, Napoleon committed his last reserve. The Imperial Guard, the army that had never been beaten in 20 years of war, marched up the slope between Hougoumont and La Haye-Sainte to deliver the final blow. But Wellington had been warned of the attack by a French deserter, and he had ordered Maitland's brigade of British Guards to lie flat in the standing rye on the reverse slope. As the leading French column crested the ridge, the British Guards rose from the ground only 30 paces in front of them, and delivered a single volley of 1,500 muskets straight into their faces. The Imperial Guard, taken in front and flank, hesitated, recoiled, and then, for the first time in its history, broke. The cry of "La Garde recule," the Guard retreats, swept the French line. At almost the same moment, the leading corps of Blücher's Prussian army crashed into Napoleon's right flank from Plancenoit. The French army dissolved into a rout. By the time the firing stopped, roughly 29,000 Frenchmen and 22,000 Allied and Prussian soldiers had been killed or wounded across the field. Wellington rode back to his headquarters that night, past the rows of dead and wounded, and wept. Riding into Brussels the next morning, he told his friend Thomas Creevey, "It has been a damned nice thing, the nearest run thing you ever saw in your life." He paused and added, "By God, I do not think it would have been done if I had not been there." He would later say of Napoleon that his presence on the field of battle made the difference of 40,000 men. The sepoy general had read the ground better than the emperor. He had hidden the weight of his army behind a ridge until the moment of decision. And when Napoleon had overextended his last reserve up that slope, he had struck. 3 habits: the careful eye, the concealed strength, and the timed counterstroke. 12 years apart, on 3 continents, against a Maratha colonel, a French marshal, and finally, the emperor himself. The same 3 habits, the same result. Thank you for watching. What is your favorite tactical move by the Duke of Wellington? And which commander should I cover next? Let me know in the comments.
And if you enjoy the content, why not subscribe? See you again soon.